Hey guys, I'm Lily O'Reilly. This is Lily O'Reilly Reviews Stuff from Quarantine. And today we're going to check in on my worms again. So let's get to that, huh? Okay, so last time we checked in, I just put a pound of worms into my giant green vermicomposter. It's been a couple weeks. They've settled in. I figure we can pop the top. We'll see how they're doing. I'll show you how I feed them. And we can talk about little stuff like that. Before we get started, I did have a couple questions on some of my prior videos that I wanted to touch on, I suppose. The most common one that I keep seeing is, what's it for? What's the point? Are they pets? Are you raising them for food? Okay, so the point of a vermicomposter is if you live somewhere that you cannot have or do not want to have a traditional compost pile, which is where you go outside and you pile stuff up and the sun and the rain and the weather and the heat and the everything causes it to degrade into soil. Like, that's plan A. But let's say you live in an apartment or you physically cannot go out and turn a compost pile with a shovel. Or you don't like the smell of compost piles because they can get a little stinky. Or like me, I live next to a big forest. I have possums, I have raccoons, I have foxes, I've got neighborhood cats, much to my chagrin, and they would all go digging through my compost pile if I put one out in the backyard. So, my solution is to use a vermicomposter. Everything's contained, it all stays in your kitchen. You use worms to eat your food, and it's a great way to deal with small to moderate amounts of vegetable and cellulose-based waste. Cool. Do you eat them? No, I do not eat them. Worms are friends, not food. I will eat a lot of weird things. Worms are not on that list. I am sure you could. I don't know. Do your own research. I don't support it personally. And yeah, are you raising them like pets? No, only one of them has a name. There's a lovely older lady in my neighborhood who likes to give me her stacks of newspaper because I don't get newspaper. And it makes great bedding. Her name is Janet. So there's one worm named Janet. I can never remember which worm, so it's usually whichever worm I pick up first. But they're not like pets. They're more like, I don't know. It's the same way, like, would you call your garbage disposal a pet? So enough about that. I'm going to rearrange you. Remember to hit the record button this time, and we're gonna look at some worms, and it'll be awesome. And before we get into the vermicomposter, I wanted to show you something I'm doing to help provide them with bedding. Because when I received the giant pound, 5 pound, the big worm bag, they came packed in shredded paper, but that doesn't last super long when you're using it in a container like this. So my go-to has been shredded newspaper. So what I do is, we're gonna put that right there to get it out of the way. I've literally just been keeping big sheets of newspaper next to my microwave. And whenever I have a spare moment, I'll pull off a strip and literally just stand here ripping it into little, 1-inch cubes. It doesn't take too long. And if you kind of just do it whenever you think about it, not super intensely or anything, it's just oh hey, I've got 3 minutes while my meal is microwaving. Let's shred a little bit of paper. It does a pretty good job of keeping the box full and providing you with substrate for them without it having to be a whole production or a lot of effort. And if you tear a strip, you get a handful of little bitty paperlets. So yeah, now let's get into the vermicomposter. Okay, so here we have my vermicomposter. I'm very dusty, generally kind of a hot mess. It lives right next to my kitchen sink because this is the most logical place for me to put my food scraps. I generally keep a small metal bowl, I think you saw it in the last video, where I just pile scraps. When I get a sufficient amount of scraps, those scraps get put into my bullet blender and I will show you what they make. So once I get a sufficient amount of scraps, I blend them up and toss them into an old pasta jar. This one has scraps from my sourdough bread, coffee grounds, eggshells, I think there's some carrot in there, whatever. I blend it up into a giant bin and then I just throw it in the fridge to keep it stable-ish, because if it's not rotten, it just smells better when you put it in. So let's see what's in here. So, this is currently my vermicomposter. Isn't he lovely? I'm gonna move the camera. So, right now what you're seeing is there are a couple little plants that have volunteered to come springing up. There is a bunch of small paper scraps and shredded newspaper on top. There's currently a light dusting of coffee grounds here, just coffee grounds, and some tea leaves that got dumped in. Most of the time I blend things up, but stuff like coffee grounds and tea leaves I'm comfortable throwing in because the coffee grounds are small enough and the tea leaves are soft enough that they don't have any issue with eating them. So now, let's disturb some worms. So when you open it up, you can see there are plenty of worms crawling around, doing whatever. It has gotten a little drier than I like, because if you look at it, how it crumbles, there's not a ton of moisture in here. So I'm going to make a point of spraying this down with water to moisten up the soil. This started out as coconut coir. Over time, it has become, even just in a couple weeks, it's gotten a lot darker. It smells like soil. There's no real negative smell to the vermicomposter, which is something I was a little worried about. By and large, the worst thing I've ever gotten is a weird, like, okay, I'm gonna be real with you, kind of smells like weed. Every now and again, you'll pop the lid and there's whatever's in here smells vaguely like the weird-ass ditch weed that my roommates used to smoke in college. But you can see here where there was a little bit of food. It still formed a bit of a mass. Overall, though, there's some paper shreds. Mostly it looks like dirt. You see some worms. Not too many, given how many were in there, but they dispersed pretty well. So what we're going to do is we're going to feed them now, because we might as well. So to feed them, you scoop out an area in your vermicomposter. You pull out your food that you're going to be feeding them. And I just scoop out a handful, wearing gloves because I still think it's kind of gross. Flatten it out and put it in the hole. Make sure you've got a decent amount. And it's really a learning process to figure out how much food goes into your worms, because it depends on the volume of worms, the volume of food, how quickly they eat, the ambient temperature, whether Mercury is in retrograde. I got no clue. You just figure it out as you go along. So that was one spot. I will generally feed in multiple spots, so I'm going to go back here, scoop up another big handful. And again, we find some places there was old food. You find some worms. Like, this is generally what a decently healthy vermicomposter looks like. So you make another hole. There's my hole. You scoop out another couple handfuls of worm food. I like to try to keep mine around room temperature because it's better for the worms, I think, to not have a sudden cold spot. But as far as I can tell, they're not super picky. So there's another pile of worm food. And you just gently bulldoze everything back in on top. And I try to only do this once a week, once every other week-ish, because you are coming into their house and just ripping shit apart, which I'm sure they don't like. So, no, my camera. So right here, we're gonna do it again. Just very gently work your fingers in so you don't hurt them as you open it up. But as you fold it back, you can see worms. Not a ton. Still trying to figure out where most of the little buggers vanished off to. But you take your food. And now that you got nice little food pats in there, bulldoze everything back in on top. And because my tank is currently drier than I want it to be, that's all just paper. But because it's drier than I want, I'm going to go through and spray it down very thoroughly with water to help with the moisture content, because these guys do not like to be dry. And that, in a nutshell, is how I've been taking care of my vermicomposter. You feed it about once a week. You water it whenever you notice that it's not as wet as you want it to be. And by and large, you just leave them alone and let them live their best life, and they eat your food. And eventually, this is going to be getting moved to somewhere with a little bit more headspace. Okay, so right now I have a 2-tier. Hang on, I will bring you over here and show you. I have a 2-tier vermicomposter. This is where any fluids or leachate collects. This is where the worms live. This is the lid. Lid. Yes. So I have a 2-tier vermicomposter. Once I move it, I've got a shelf over there that I'm building for my vermicomposter. Once I move it, I'm going to put a 2nd tier on top of here. That way there are 2 giant areas for the worms to breed and live and be happy and do little wormy things like they want to do. And I think once I have that, it'll actually turn out to be a lot better of a setup, because I can put more food in, because it can support a larger population of worms. So, yeah, that's what I got for right now. The worms seem to be doing okay. They're trucking along, they're eating plenty. They seem to be happy. So, yes, I know I say so too much. It's a verbal tick. Oh well. So yeah, it is pretty good. I'm going to check back in if anything interesting happens, but for right now, the status is quo and the worms are worming. I'm not going to do the spiel today. I'm going to let it roll to credits, but thank you. I enjoy y'all, and I'm really glad that everybody's as invested in my worms as I am, because it's pretty nifty. So go, be safe, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye!